I once had it all. Fame, fortune, and a wonderful wife. But in the end, I still feel like I lost something most important. That is what Paul Hogan, now 86 years old, has finally admitted after decades of hiding behind jokes and a grin the whole world recognized. For a man who built his entire career on never being impressed by anyone, on deflecting seriousness with a punchline, this confession lands differently. It is not a joke. It is the sound of a man finally telling the truth about the price of everything he won. To understand what he lost, you have to go back to where he started, long before the hat, the knife, and the Outback. Paul Hogan was born on October 8, 1939, in Parramatta, in Western Sydney, the son of working people with no particular plan for him beyond an honest trade. He left school without distinction, worked as a rigger on the Sydney Harbour Bridge, and picked up extra shifts as a lifeguard at a public pool in Granville to make ends meet. It was at that pool, in 1958, that he met Nolene Edwards. She was 18. He was 19. There was no elaborate courtship, no grand gesture. Just two teenagers who liked each other and decided, the way young people often do, that liking each other was enough. They married that same year, and within a few years they had 3 sons, eventually 5 children in total. Paul kept working the bridge. Nolene kept the household running. Neither of them knew yet that one of them was about to become one of the most famous men in the world. The turn came in 1971, on a television talent program called New Faces. Paul Hogan didn't audition as a performer. He walked onto the set as a heckler, mocking the judges for humiliating the contestants, appearing in his work boots and banging 2 shovels together for effect. Audiences loved it so much he was invited back again and again, and a producer at a current affair took notice. What followed was the Paul Hogan Show, 60 episodes across more than a decade, built on the same persona that had worked on that first night, the ordinary Australian who refuses to be impressed by anyone who thinks they deserve to be. Hogan has said many times that the hardest transition of his life wasn't Hollywood or international fame. It was those early years of television, when he was, in his own words, poor and famous at the same time, and found that combination deeply uncomfortable. Through all of it, Nolene remained largely out of the public eye, raising their children while her husband became a household name. In 1981, after 23 years of marriage, they divorced. Then, in a twist that made the story more painful in hindsight, they reconciled less than a year later and remarried in 1982. It seemed, for a moment, like proof that 3 decades of shared history could outlast anything fame threw at it. It didn't survive what came next. In 1985, Hogan traveled into the Australian outback to film a movie he had co-written and staked his career on, a film called Crocodile, Dundee. Cast opposite him was an American actress named Linda Kozlowski, a Juilliard-trained performer who had built a reputation on Broadway, including a notable turn in a revival of Death of a Salesman alongside Dustin Hoffman, whose personal recommendation is widely reported to have helped her land the audition. Kozlowski arrived on set to punishing conditions, crocodile-infested waters, a production crew that reportedly stationed an armed guard near the water during shoots, and by all accounts never once complained. Hogan later told People magazine that the production had expected the danger to frighten her off, and it simply didn't. What developed between them during filming became, according to those close to the production, impossible to miss. The film's director has spoken about watching the two of them grow closer as filming went on. Hogan's longtime friend Delvine Delaney has said that Kozlowski herself was troubled by the fact that Hogan was a married father of 5, but that whatever was happening between them felt unstoppable. Crocodile Dundee premiered in 1986 and became a global phenomenon, earning roughly $300 million worldwide against a fraction of that budget, launching Hogan into international stardom and Kozlowski into a Golden Globe nomination. It also ended his marriage to Nolene for good. The Australian press at the time described the divorce as one of the ugliest and most publicly dissected celebrity splits the country had seen. Nolene, who had never sought the spotlight, found herself at the center of a media storm not of her making. She responded with a single, quietly devastating line that has followed the story ever since, "I had the best years of his life." It would later emerge that Paul did not speak to Nolene for 17 years after their final divorce. 17 years of silence between a man and the woman who had stood beside him since he was a teenager with nothing but calloused hands and a good sense of humor. Nolene eventually rebuilt her own life away from the cameras. In 2000, she married a businessman named Reed Stretton, and by most accounts the two shared a genuinely happy, low-profile life together until his death in 2017. Paul, meanwhile, married Linda Kozlowski in May 1990 in Sydney. He was 51. She was 32. In interviews from that period, Hogan spoke about her with open adoration, telling Woman's Day that she had always been too good for him. They made films together, including Crocodile Dundee 2, which performed well commercially even as critics noted the novelty fading, while Almost an Angel in 1990 struggled badly at the box office, proof, perhaps, that audiences wanted Mick Dundee, not Paul Hogan reinvented. But behind the public image of a fairy-tale romance, something quieter and harder was unfolding. Kozlowski has spoken candidly about the cost of that marriage to her own career, turning down roles she considered demeaning, working through a string of direct-to-video films in the 1990s that she later described as personally corrosive, before stepping away from acting almost entirely after their son Chance was born in 1998. She told an interviewer in 2001 that she was happy and content with motherhood, but contentment built on sacrifice rarely lasts forever. Friends have said she eventually felt as though she had disappeared into being Mrs. Hogan, losing the identity she had trained her whole life to build. In October 2013, Kozlowski filed for divorce in Los Angeles. The settlement reportedly included a lump payment and the right to remain in their home for a limited period, while Hogan retained the rights to the character that had made them both famous. Kozlowski later told New Idea that after years living in his shadow, it felt good to finally exist in her own light. Hogan, for his part, told the Daily Telegraph with characteristic self-deprecation that he was simply too difficult a man to stay married to for more than about 25 years at a stretch. Kozlowski later traveled to Morocco, met a tour guide, and described falling in love with a sense of familiarity that felt as though they had known each other for a lifetime. They married in 2017. Reports at the time suggested Hogan was more affected by the news than his public statements let on, privately described by sources as devastated by her decision to leave America entirely. And yet, in a strange gesture of continued care, friends have said Kozlowski has remained quietly concerned about his health ever since, particularly urging him for years to quit smoking. Hogan's later life has brought its own hardships, a lengthy Australian tax investigation in the 2000s, physical decline in his 80s, and in 2024 a bittersweet public reunion with Kozlowski for the restored re-release of the original Crocodile Dundee film. Standing beside her again, decades older, he reportedly deflected the emotional weight of the moment with a joke about how the restoration made him look better than he remembered. Now, at 86, having lived through 2 marriages, 2 very different women, and decades of quiet private cost behind the public laughter, Paul Hogan has said the words plainly: she was the love of his life. Whether he meant Linda or, in some deeper unspoken way, Nolene, the woman who knew him before any of it began, may be a question even he hasn't fully answered for himself. What remains clear is this: fame gave Paul Hogan the world, but it could not give him back the ordinary, unglamorous love he walked away from to get there. And at the end of a life lived so loudly, that quiet regret may be the truest thing he has ever said. I once had it all. Fame, fortune, and a wonderful wife. But in the end, I still feel like I lost something most important. That is what Paul Hogan, now 86 years old, has finally admitted after decades of hiding behind jokes and a grin the whole world recognized. For a man who built his entire career on never being impressed by anyone, on deflecting seriousness with a punchline, this confession lands differently. It is not a joke. It is the sound of a man finally telling the truth about the price of everything he won. To understand what he lost, you have to go back to where he started, long before the hat, the knife, and the Outback. Paul Hogan was born on October 8, 1939, in Parramatta, in Western Sydney, the son of working people.